Have you ever had somebody in your life who left you constantly wondering, what exactly is going on here? One day they're incredibly warm, the next they're distant. They tell you they care about you, but their behaviour doesn't always look like it. They pull you close, then they push you away. They disappear, then suddenly reappear as though nothing happened. And perhaps the strangest thing is this: the more confusing the relationship becomes, the more you think about it. You analyse conversations, you reread messages, you wonder what you said, you try to work out what changed, and eventually this person can occupy an extraordinary amount of space in your head. So you conclude, I must really care about them. Maybe you do. But there's another possibility. Perhaps part of what is keeping you emotionally attached isn't love, it's uncertainty. Because the human brain has a very interesting relationship with things it cannot resolve. And mixed signals create an unfinished puzzle. So today I want to look at why uncertainty can sometimes keep us attached to people far longer than certainty ever would. The brain doesn't like unfinished business. Human beings like resolutions. We like answers. We like knowing where we stand. Think about how irritating it is when you're trying to remember somebody's name. You know that you know it. It's somewhere in your brain, and suddenly you can't think about anything else. Then at 3 o'clock in the morning, David, there it is. The brain wants to close the loop. Relationships can create the same effect. When somebody's behaviour doesn't make sense, the brain keeps returning to it. Why did they say that? Why did they disappear? Why were they affectionate yesterday and distant today? What does this relationship actually mean? And because there isn't a clear answer, the question remains active. This can create the illusion that the person must be incredibly important to us. But sometimes they're occupying our mind simply because our brain cannot finish the story. Certainty can actually set us free. Imagine somebody says to you, I don't want a relationship with you. Painful, absolutely, but clear. There's nothing to interpret. Your brain may hate the answer, but it has an answer. Now compare that with, I don't know what I want. Maybe one day. I need some space. I love you, but the timing isn't right. I can't give you what you want at the moment. Let's just see what happens. And suddenly the door isn't open. But it isn't completely closed. And human beings can spend years standing outside a half-open door. Because maybe is incredibly powerful. No allows grief to begin. Maybe keeps hope alive. Mixed signals create hypervigilance. When somebody is predictable, you don't need to constantly monitor them. You know roughly what to expect. But when somebody is unpredictable, your attention increases. Imagine you're walking through a field and there's a perfectly calm cow standing in the corner. You probably don't pay much attention to it. Now imagine the cow occasionally charges at people without warning. Suddenly, you're watching the cow. Where is it? What's it doing? Is it looking at me? Your brain becomes vigilant because unpredictability might matter. And something similar can happen emotionally. If somebody's affection is inconsistent, you start watching their tone, their messages, how quickly they reply, whether they've used a kiss at the end of the text. And yesterday there were 3 kisses, today there's 1. What has happened? A perfectly intelligent adult can suddenly become a forensic investigator, analysing punctuation. Not because they've lost their mind, because uncertainty increases attention. Intermittent reinforcement. We touched on this earlier in the series, but it deserves much more attention because it's incredibly important. Psychologists use the term intermittent reinforcement to describe rewards that arrive unpredictably. If something good happens every single time, the brain quickly learns the pattern. But when the reward is unpredictable, sometimes yes, sometimes no, behaviour can become remarkably persistent. It's one of the mechanisms that makes gambling so compelling. You don't know when the next reward will arrive. Now apply that to relationships. Someone gives you affection, then withdraws, then affection returns, then disappears. You don't know when the next good moment is coming, so you wait. And when it finally arrives, the emotional relief can be enormous. You think, we're okay again. That relief is powerful. But here's the important part. Sometimes what feels like an enormous emotional high is partly the sudden removal of anxiety that the person created in the first place. They haven't necessarily made you incredibly happy, they've temporarily stopped making you anxious. And that's quite a distinction. This is why consistency can initially feel boring. This creates a very strange problem. If you spent a long time experiencing relationships filled with uncertainty, you may begin associating emotional intensity with connection. Then you meet somebody consistent. They'll say, they'll ring. They ring. They make plans. They turn up. They tell you how they feel. Their behaviour tomorrow broadly resembles their behaviour today. And part of you thinks, is that it? Where's the drama? Where's the enormous rush? Where's the analysing? Where's the glorious reunion after 3 weeks of wondering what on earth is happening? It's gone. And sometimes we interpret the absence of anxiety as the absence of chemistry. But perhaps what has disappeared isn't passion. Perhaps what's disappeared is the instability. If your nervous system has learnt that love comes with uncertainty, calm can initially feel unfamiliar. And humans frequently mistake unfamiliar for wrong. Mixed signals don't always mean manipulation. This is important. Not everybody giving mixed signals is deliberately playing games. People can be genuinely conflicted. Someone can care about you and still be frightened of commitment. They may be dealing with their own emotional problems. They may genuinely not know what they want. They may have competing responsibilities. They may be confused. They may want intimacy and simultaneously be frightened by it. Human beings are complicated. But here's the important distinction. Their confusion doesn't have to become your permanent living arrangement. You can have compassion for somebody who doesn't know what they want, without spending 3 years waiting for them to decide. You don't need to establish malicious intent before deciding that uncertainty is hurting you. Mixed signals, we become attached to the good version. Mixed signal relationships often contain genuinely wonderful moments. That's part of what makes them difficult to leave. When it's good, it's really good. You connect, you laugh, you feel understood. Perhaps they're affectionate, present. Everything suddenly makes sense. And you think, this is the real relationship. Then they withdraw. And now you're not necessarily grieving the entire relationship. You're waiting for the good version to return because you've seen it. You know it exists. And every time it reappears, your hope is renewed. This is why somebody can tolerate months of uncertainty because of a handful of extraordinary days. The good moments become evidence of what the relationship could be. But again, potential enters the room. And eventually we have to ask, which version is actually the pattern? Not which version do I prefer? Which version appears consistently? Words and behaviour can tell two different stories. Mixed signals often happen because words and actions don't match. Someone says, I really care about you, but rarely makes time for you. You're incredibly important to me, but you're constantly wondering where you stand. I don't want to lose you. But they don't seem particularly interested in building anything with you either. And this is where people become trapped trying to decide which information is true, the words or the behaviour. Perhaps both are true. Somebody may genuinely care about you and still not be capable of giving you what you need. That's uncomfortable because we prefer simple categories. They love me or they don't. They care or they don't. But human beings can care deeply and still behave inconsistently. So perhaps the better question isn't, do they care about me? Perhaps it's, does this relationship work for me? Those are two very different questions. We can spend years trying to solve somebody else. This is another trap. If you're analytical, empathetic, or naturally curious about human behaviour, an inconsistent person can become an irresistible puzzle. You want to understand them. Why do they withdraw? Why are they frightened? What happened in their childhood? What's their attachment style? What are they protecting themselves from? And perhaps you eventually understand them brilliantly. Congratulations! You've completed a PhD in somebody who still isn't giving you a functioning relationship. Understanding can be useful, but eventually you need to ask, what am I going to do with this information? Because explaining someone's behaviour doesn't automatically change it. And sometimes endless analysis is simply another way of avoiding the decision we already know we need to make. The search for closure. This is where people often say, I just need closure, and sometimes the final conversation genuinely helps. But we can also become convinced that closure is something another person has to give us. We need the explanation, the confession, the apology, the final conversation where everything suddenly makes sense. But what if they can't give you that? What if they don't understand their own behaviour? What if their explanation changes again? What if they simply disappear? Do you remain emotionally trapped forever because they failed to provide the correct ending? At some point, closure may have to become something you create yourself. Sometimes closure is simply, I don't fully understand why they behave this way, but I understand what the experience did to me. That may be enough. Confusion itself is information. This is a very simple idea that can save people enormous amounts of time. If a relationship leaves you chronically confused, the confusion is part of the relationship. We keep thinking, once I understand what's happening, everything will be fine. But perhaps what's happening is you're in a relationship that repeatedly makes you confused. That's information. Healthy relationships aren't perfectly predictable. People have bad days, circumstances change, misunderstandings happen, but generally you know where you stand. You don't need to decode somebody every morning. You don't need to spend your life asking friends, what do you think they meant by this? There is a basic emotional consistency. And consistency allows the nervous system to relax. Watch what happens to your life while you're waiting. This is something we don't talk about enough. When you're waiting for somebody to decide, your own life can quietly go on hold. You don't make other choices because, what if they come back? You don't emotionally detach because, what if things change? You don't fully move forwards because the possibility remains. Months pass, sometimes years, and the other person may not even realise that your life has become organised around their uncertainty. That's when you have to reclaim the decision. They may not know what they want. Fine. What do you want? They may need another 6 months. Fine. Do you want to give them 6 months? They may come back. Fine. Do you want to build your future around that possibility? The moment you ask those questions, you stop being entirely dependent on their decision. Clarity doesn't always come from the other person. Sometimes we keep asking somebody else for clarity when their behaviour has already provided it. What are we? Where is this going? How do I feel? And perhaps they've answered verbally many times, but their behaviour keeps producing a different answer. Eventually, you may have enough information. Not necessarily the information you wanted, but enough to make your own decision. Because clarity isn't always somebody saying, here is exactly what I intend to do. Sometimes clarity is you recognising, whatever they intend, this situation is no longer acceptable to me. That's your clarity. And you don't need their agreement to have it. How do we break the hold of mixed signals? First, stop analysing individual moments and look at the pattern. Not, they sent me a beautiful message yesterday. Look at the 6 months. What has the relationship actually been like? Second, separate words from behaviour. Do they match? Third, notice what the relationship is doing to you. Are you relaxed, secure, able to concentrate on your own life? Or are you constantly monitoring, analysing and waiting? And finally, stop asking only, what do they want? Ask, what do I want? The question can be surprisingly difficult when you spent months focused entirely on somebody else's behaviour. And in closing, so if you've ever found yourself unable to let go of somebody who gives you mixed signals, perhaps you don't immediately assume it's because the person is the love of your life. Maybe they are important to you. Maybe there is genuine love there. But also ask, how much of my attachment is being fueled by my uncertainty? Am I waiting for the next good moment? Am I attached to the relationship or to its potential? Am I trying to solve a puzzle that doesn't actually have an answer? And the biggest question, if nothing about this situation has changed, how long would I be willing to live like this? A month? A year? 5 years? Because uncertainty can keep us waiting indefinitely if we allow somebody else to decide when our life moves forward. Sometimes the answer we're desperately waiting for doesn't arrive, and sometimes we don't need it. Because eventually you'll realize that another person's confusion doesn't require your own confusion. Their indecision doesn't require your waiting, and their mixed signals don't have to become the background noise of your life. Sometimes peace begins with a remarkably simple decision. If you cannot give me clarity, I will create my own. I'm Sara Wheeler, and if you enjoy exploring the psychology behind modern life, relationships, and why human beings behave the way they do, subscribe to my channel, because you're not broken, you're brought.